I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Delano Squires.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, we have a packed show today. Inez is going to start off on a topic that she's been thinking and writing on lately, that it's the tragic death of Jordan Neely on the New York City subway. You've probably seen the viral video by now, but we are going to break down all of the different implications. Delano has a really interesting topic. He's going to discuss the anti-marriage men of the right. It's not just Andrew Tate, says Delano, and we'll tell you why. I'm going to be talking about negotiations over the debt ceiling that unfold here in Washington, D.C., and Josh is going to give us kind of a download on CPAC Hungary. He's just got back from that. So we're excited to go through all of these different issues, and I'm going to kick it over to Inez to start us off.
Thanks, Emily. So obviously there's this now nationwide case of the Neely case in New York. I think that will probably become as iconic a name as the Bernie Getz case, if in fact he's charged. And I'll get to a bit of the more optimistic side of this right at the end before I give everyone the facts. So the background of this, of course, is the general rise of disorder and crime in New York City. New York is not unique in this. In fact, I've elsewhere argued that actually it's getting an undeserved reputation for being the worst at it, when in reality it isn't. But it is certainly the reality that life in New York has become more dangerous with regard to disorder and crime than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And the trends are not in a good direction. And in particular, on the subway. And in fact, even this current administration recognized that there is a very worrying spike in subway violence, which is why they have actually taken the step of putting more cops on the subway, which seems to be helping somewhat with some of the violence. Nevertheless, every time you take the subway, you are trapped in an enclosed space with other people, some of whom are crazy and violent and mean you harm. So just one such case happened last week with Jordan Neely. Mr. Neely was a 30-year-old homeless person. The news, of course, is using the new phrase Michael Jackson impersonator to describe him, right? That is true. He was a Michael Jackson impersonator several years ago, but those who have observed him, and he was a known quantity, and I'll get to that in a minute, observed that he was not actually doing that anymore. He was declining into one of two things, either drug-induced or just sheer mental illness-induced downward spiral. He had been violent in the past. He had, now I'm seeing conflicting reportings, anywhere from 42 to 44 prior arrests, 4 of which were for assault. He had pushed a woman towards the tracks in the subway, fortunately did not succeed. The latest warrant out for his arrest was for felony assault for punching a 67-year-old woman in her face, doing quite a bit of damage to her, unfortunately. And I give you all of this background because when he was on the subway, he was apparently screaming and threatening people on the subway, but he had not yet actually become violent. A young Marine, actually between active tours, put him in a chokehold to subdue him. He says not to attempt to kill him, to subdue him. He was helped in this task by 2 other men in the subway car. And very notable on the video, you don't hear a single person in the subway car say, "Get off him," let him go, right? It seems that the subway car was quite united in the perception of a threat from Jordan Neely. So unfortunately, though, by the time the police got there and transported him to a hospital, he had died, and the coroner has ruled the death a homicide, which is very clearly does not imply murder, right? Just that he died as a result of this interaction, according to the coroner, although we're still waiting for the tox screen to get back. So those are kind of the background facts. And initially, I thought this was definitely going to be a replay of the Bernie Getz case from 1984, except worse, because in all cultural measures, of course, as we cover every year on this program, or every week on this program, rather, by all cultural measures, we have gotten worse, right? I've become slightly more optimistic. There have been protests And certainly all the usual suspects from the New York Times to AOC are attempting to turn this into a racial incident. I believe one of the squad called it a lynching, right? Because the Marine is white and Neely is black. But actually the response has been quite muted. And it doesn't seem like it's actually, I see all the people trying to make it into the new Summer of Floyd, but I'm not really seeing the response that incident garnered, even here in New York City. Yes, there have been protests and arrests at those protests, but I don't feel the same sort of simmering anger here, in part similarly to the Getz case. I think the average person in this city, AOC aside, is actually extremely fed up with having to deal with schizophrenic and potentially violent madmen in enclosed spaces on the subway. There is, just to put in my opinion, then I'll kick it out to the rest of you. The real culprit here is, of course, progressive policies in New York and in other cities that allow people who are mentally ill, unstable, and violent repeatedly out on the street. Neely should not be dead because she should have never been on that subway car with his record. He was known to all of the services. By the way, New York spends $30,000 per homeless person per year on services for the homeless. This guy was known to all of those homeless organizations. He was on a so-called top 50 list of people who desperately needed help. He was forcibly committed briefly, but then let out on his own recognizance to continue taking his meds. Every step of the way, we see not a system that had him, quote unquote, slip through the cracks, but rather a system that has made the conscious choice to have a revolving door and to deal with serious mental illness, as opposed to what the left is always talking about, in terms of mental services and mental illness. Serious mental illness breaks with reality, schizophrenia, this type of very dangerous mental illness that makes you a danger to yourself as well as to others, has chosen to allow these people to continue to live and do drugs on the street, where they can menace themselves and others on the street. That is the story here, and that's the real culprit here. Not this brave Marine who almost certainly correctly and certainly reasonably interpreted that this guy actually was not just going to scream and flail about, but was potentially going to be violent and move to protect himself and others on that subway car. A just society, which we all know we no longer live in, but a just society does not force ordinary people during the course of their commutes to determine the levels of violence and schizophrenia in raving lunatics and make a guess as to whether this one is the one who will actually harm them or not. But I'm sorry, with that, I've taken way too much time, and I'll kick it out to the rest of you.
Yeah, so I'd love to jump in. I share much of your take, Inez, but there's some parts where I would differ. Really quickly, I'll say, one, I grew up in New York. I spent over 3 hours a day on public transportation going to and from school, from 8th to 12th grade. Been on the train, countless times. I've seen homeless people on the train, schizophrenics, people yelling, screaming, doing all sorts of stuff. It in some ways becomes part of New York City public transportation culture, which is a sad commentary on the way of life there. And I also share your perspective as it relates to allowing lawlessness to take root, and then some people being surprised when you get nothing but disorder. So I understand both of those positions, but there's still a part of me that says, that there are other ways to potentially handle a situation like this. And I think the part that really sticks in my craw is that the Marine approached Neely from behind. And it may seem like a small detail to some people, but if you put your arms around a person, whether you call it a headlock, a chokehold, whatever term you use for it, yes, you're going to have somebody that flails and kicks around, and you're going to need multiple people to restrain them. If it would have been slightly different if the people on the train said, hey man, chill out, or shut up or whatever. But there's a part of me that I don't know. It's hard to digest the part of it where it's an engagement from behind. And again, I know that may seem like a small detail to some people, but at the end of the day, this young man lost his life tragically, of course. And I saw certain I saw certain responses online that, in some respects, in my estimation, sort of diminish the humanity that's at play here. And I wrote in a piece in the Blaze, and I'll finish off here, that Tucker Carlson's recently revealed text where he talked about that the sort of tribal impulse to want to see his enemies get their comeuppance, I thought was actually very instructive for this particular incident, because my sense is that a lot of the reaction is fueled by tribalism on both sides. I think if you switched out the identities and you concocted a situation where it was people that conservatives would feel a little bit more sympathetic towards, who was deemed a threat or aggressive and had not physically harmed someone, I think some of us would have different perspectives on it. So I'll say that, and again, I completely agree with the position that the subways have become a place of lawlessness. A woman named Elizabeth Gomes was viciously attacked in the Queens subway, lost her eye, I think last year. People have been pushed on the train tracks, have feces smeared on them. One lady in the Bronx even took to chaining herself to a subway column before the train pulled up because of this. So it's sad all around, and I think there's some serious soul searching that Gothamites need to do with respect to these types of situations.
Yeah, so I'll be super quick because we're real short on time on this segment. I agree with Inez's bottom line take. This is something that I have been beating for a while now, which is that this country desperately needs to revisit its 1960s, 1970s era reforms when it comes to the liberalization of institutional commitment. I mean, the tragedy is that Jordan Neely would be alive if society had treated someone like Jordan Neely the way that he deserved to be treated, which was someone with this level of mental illness simply should not be operating in society. And we knew that. I mean, the fact that he was on the New York City top 50 people to watch list, that is the tragedy. It's like we literally knew him by his name, by his identity as someone who desperately needed help. And because society has just imbibed all these various liberal bromides about kind of the inherent dignity of the homeless and how they can't be committed, whatever, this was the tragic result. I will certainly echo Delano's kind of emphasis on the humanity here as well. I think some people on the other side have definitely taken this a little far as well. It's just a very disturbing story, but my kind of public policy takeaway, which Inez, I think, underscored, was kind of the revisiting of institutional commitment.
Yeah, the people on the train should not have been put in that position, and Jordan Neely himself should not have been put in that position. And there are more people slipping through the cracks of our society because of an insane ideology that is counterintuitive and backwards, that can only be justified in a total postmodern, post-truth society. And that's where we are. The Marine is really, frankly, the last of the dominoes to fall that had to get to where we got. And so, as we can Monday morning quarterback and we can look at, what could have been done differently on a crowded subway train, the bottom line is we can all agree that we got there because of unfortunate circumstances and because the left monopolized criminal justice reform and crime discourse in the country for a really long time. And it's making everyone unsafe, whether you're a passenger or the victim perpetrator in this case, the same. Delano, I'll toss it over to you.
Sure. So I really want to touch on something that I see sort of ascending on the online space, which is center-right men, someone, describe themselves as conservative, who are promoting an anti-marriage, anti-family narrative to the people who follow them. So the most recent example of this is from a Twitter account from someone named Rollo Tomasi, who says, the quickest path to becoming a high-value man: 1, do not get married. 2, avoid family creation. 3, vasectomy in your 20s. 4, lift consistently. 5, eliminate all sedations. 6, learn game and networking. 7, play to your strengths, build wealth. And 8, resist easing up on your focus. I've seen similar things. I mean, this sounds a lot like someone like Andrew Tate, but Andrew Tate is an online personality. He's a lot younger than I believe Rollo Tomasi is, and I'm concerned that this is the message that we're sending to young men. We talked in the last segment about at least part of this, the Neely situation, particularly as it relates to Marine, is are we training young men to run away from their instincts towards bravery? And I think selling young men on a message that avoiding marriage and family, including a vasectomy in your 20s, is the way to be a high value, giga chad, is exactly the wrong message that guys need to be hearing right now. So I've responded to a few of these people. My position is always the same. It's like, if you are a king with no queen and no heirs, you're just a rich man in a house. And I think this is the type of message that's being pushed out in some online circles. I'm not sure the extent to which it's resonating, but it is something that I think that conservatives should be concerned about, because if you have radical feminists on the left telling women to avoid marriage because it's an oppressive trap and a tool of the patriarchy, and then you have radical men on the right telling young men to avoid marriage because it's a trap and it's a tool of the matriarchy and a corrupt, sort of divorce and family court system, that does not bode well for the future of society or the future of the world. So with that, I'll toss it out to the rest of the group.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, and I'm not like incredibly worried that this is sweeping the young conservative movement, but I do think it's sort of the logical conclusion of it's like getting into Nietzsche. It's when we tear everything down, young men are going to believe that it's justified and righteous that you become your own god. That is the only purpose, is to sort of become your master of the universe, and that means eschewing all of the traditions that knit social fabric together. And children are obviously an important part of that. You are not a responsible. It's one of those things that pushes you to be. I'm speaking as a childless person, of course, but it pushes you to be a more invested in the future of humanity, in the future of your local community, in the future of your family. It is the civilizing feature. It is how we progress as a species. And so, no, maybe it's not best for you as an individual, but that's what this really gets to at the end of the day, is that we have stripped away all of the parts of society so that people believe what is righteous and what is manly is just intense individualism. And that's the fault of just the kind of nihilistic worldview that we pushed on everybody for a long time. So, it's the obvious logical conclusion. I worry about it infecting everyone, whether you're right or left. I think we're definitely going to see it crop up on the right, because there are young men who are looking for purpose in every kind of political philosophy right now, whether that's far left or far right. They're looking for purpose in it. We can talk about all the male feminists that find purpose in it on the left. So I do expect it to come up more often. But that said, I think it's going to be a much broader, deeper societal problem with men in the years to come, specifically with Gen Z men. I think we're really starting to see it manifest. So it's very much something to pay attention to.
So a few points here. I agree that it's a logical consequence of the atomization, and I agree with everything that Emily said and actually about this. But I do want to make another brief point. It is also the logical consequence of policy choices in family law that we've made. We have a legal structure around marriage and divorce and family that does disadvantage men quite severely in certain instances. So I think that's part of where a lot of the fire from this comes from, to the extent it's like kind of two groups. It's the Nietzschean young folks in their early 20s. And then the other half of this, I think, is a lot of divorced dads who have been really treated unfairly by the court system. And I think that adds a lot of legitimacy and sort of fire to that position. Sort of on a 10,000 foot level response, right? We talk about, I think we have talked about the longhouse here. I feel like that's part of the response here. But it's important to remember that it's not actually a matriarchy. It's a gynocracy, right? There is something important about recognizing the complementarity of men and women that is, I think, being lost in some of this discourse. That being said, I think kind of the overly sort of traditional conservative response sometimes misses something corresponding on the other side, and that's to Emily's sort of Nietzschean point, that our current modern society provides very few opportunities for glory for young men. We live in a bureaucratic economy where a lot of opportunities financially or require a certain kind of personality type of knuckling under in a bureaucracy and a certain kind of cooperation that is feminine and not necessarily in a bad way when applied correctly. I think these are complementary sort of values and instincts, but there is a place for sort of masculine virtues as well. And I think we have lost a lot of the places for men to seek glory. And I think that what we're seeing with what Delano brought up with these kinds of tweets about, like, we don't need women, right? We can go our own way. We don't need women. I think it comes from, one, that lack of outlets for a lot of the masculine virtues, or lack of honors in society for those virtues. But also, look, at the end of the day, the war between the sexes can't really go on forever if there is going to be a future for the human race, right? And some of this is a bit of, it seems to me to be the flip side of, Delano said this is the flip side of sort of a bitter feminist left. I think it is that in a different way as well, which is, a lot of feminism seems to be bitterness at men for desiring certain attributes in women, like youth and fertility and beauty. On the flip side, it seems like a lot of, no, I don't even want to say a lot, but there's a certain corner of sort of the right wing manosphere or whatever that seems to resent women for the things that they bring to the table and the things that they desire. And I think that that's equally immature. And as I said, at the end, the war can't go on forever if there's going to be a future. So
I'm happy that Emily brought up Nietzsche, because that definitely steals my thunder a little bit. This is kind of Delano helpfully shining a spotlight on the anthropological pitfalls of kind of the BAP physiognomy at all costs gym rat wing of the right. And this has been kind of a silent kind of boiling kind of tension that has been simmering, I think, for a few years now, between kind of some in kind of the NatCon sphere and some in kind of the true more dissident elements of kind of the gym rat right. And I think that this is a good time to try to kind of look at that and kind of soberly analyze that, and try to just like discuss what paths there might be towards reconciling these differences. But look, from a very basic worldview, okay, if you are talking about kind of individualism as the be all end all, if you are valorizing vasectomies, for God's sake, in your 20s, you have some serious soul searching to do. If I could, not to put too fine a point on it, but you are a profound loser. You are literally a loser. And that is like a kindergarten juvenile insult, but you are a loser if you are the kind of person who is forswearing procreation, who is forswearing family formation, who is forswearing anything remotely resembling kind of your obligation, your duty to pass down your intergenerational customs, your traits, your nation, your faith in God, your way of life, your very vitality and your livelihood. You are an absolute loser. And it makes me think, to a certain extent, of someone who I didn't necessarily expect to kind of invoke on today's show, but the infamous white supremacist Jew hater Nick Fuentes, who is sometimes fond of talking about his own kind of forswearing of dating. And he has basically said that, he's basically had his own take on kind of the old school kind of playground. Oh, chicks are for, word that I will not say, kind of an anti-homosexual pejorative. So that's kind of really what I'm hearing here. It's bad. It's wrong. It is totally anathema, I think, to the National Conservatism Project. It's very much anathema to kind of the Hungarian Conservatism Project, which I will talk about a little bit in my own segment. But I think that this is very toxic, bad stuff. And I'm happy that Delano is sharing a spotlight on it.
All right, with that, we are going to make a really hard pivot to the debt ceiling. It's an ongoing negotiation. Actually, as we talk about this today, Kevin McCarthy and President Biden, they may actually be meeting like literally as we're recording this on Tuesday. But we continue to follow the story because it has implications for the Republican Party. It obviously has major implications for the country in general. But there are a couple of things I want to just tease out that have happened in the last week. One, it is remarkable that Kevin McCarthy got his conference behind a debt ceiling bill. It has about $5 trillion worth of cut in agreement for raising the debt ceiling $1.5 trillion. Okay. So the fact that this is all cuts to all kinds of things, student loan repayment or student loan forgiveness. Then it goes into what else? Green energy tax credits, all this kind of ticky-tack stuff that they cobbled together to get $4.8 trillion worth of cuts for. Kevin McCarthy manages to get his conference behind that bill. If he were a Democrat, he would have glowing profiles. They would be writing about what kind of sunglasses and coats that he wears, like they did with Nancy Pelosi, and would be dubbed, what did Pelosi call herself? A master legislator, something like that. But the media would surely bestow such a title upon Kevin McCarthy himself, because when you have a conference that divided, to be able to get them together when the stakes aren't even that high with just the bill itself, to bridge the sort of the Freedom Caucus wing that obviously initially impeded McCarthy's ability even to be speaker with that very long balloting process. So that's two big wins for Kevin McCarthy just tactically over the course of this early like half year, not even half year of the legislative session or of this Congress. And on that note, Mitch McConnell was out of the Senate due to an injury that he sustained for weeks. So he was MIA in these negotiations, understandably so. He was recovering, and we're obviously glad that he recovered. Kind of a passing of the baton to Kevin McCarthy, not a willing passing of the baton, but very interesting that McCarthy stepped successfully into that power vacuum. Mike Lee united just like 43 senators behind his, what was it actually? Let me get the right number here. He unites all of these senators behind a letter. 43 Republican senators signed a letter by Mike Lee last week saying that they will only vote to raise the debt ceiling with conditions. Biden has said that's an impasse. I'm only going to do a clean debt ceiling bill. Boom, because any of his agenda is on the table as soon as you add conditions. He's going to have to take a hit on his agenda. He knows that if there are conditions. So that you get 43 Republican senators on that list, that you have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema potentially siding with Republicans on this, it is a huge problem for the Biden administration, which is now going to have to negotiate over its agenda. And that doesn't mean that Kevin McCarthy isn't going to run into some troubles. It doesn't mean Republicans aren't going to be the ones that look silly when this all happens, because the media will always cast Republicans as obstructionists, even if we are drowning in debt, even if they have good reasons for asking for cuts, even if everything is reasonable. Doesn't matter. The media is going to side with the Democrats and with the Biden administration. So I'm not saying this is going to be a political win for Republicans, but I am saying tactically, strategically, it's going very well for Republicans. And the window for them, for the Biden administration, is really narrowing for them to negotiate on this. So let me kick it open to the group.
So I mean, I don't have like a huge take on this. I mean, like the rest of you and like probably a lot of others who are professionally in this space, I get all my like morning political playbook newsletters whenever, and I'll be totally honest with you, my eyes tend to gloss over when it gets to the various kind of machinations and like the inevitable kind of game of chicken that, you know, in kind of a classic kind of game theory sense always is kind of the debt ceiling fight. And it kind of gives me like a nice throwback to the Tea Party era and the shutdown and Boehner and sequestration. You remember that word? That was a word from 12 years ago now. I guess my broader kind of conceptual objection to a lot of this. I mean, to be clear, the national debt is obviously a problem, and there is no foreseeable path whatsoever towards remedying that, short of some sort of days, just like act of God, basically, right? I mean, like that's effectively the point that we're at. So from my perspective, I can't help but kind of cringe a little bit when I see kind of the revival of kind of this Tea Party era kind of, slash the deficit, slash the debt style of political gamesmanship and game of chicken. It's fundamentally loser politics. It is a losing strategy. Obviously, the media will blame Republicans for anything whatsoever that happens to the credit rating, to the stock market, blah, blah, blah. We're used to that by now. But this is just not winning terrain. This is not winning terrain for Republicans and conservatives to engage upon. Rather, our winning terrain right now is to an extent, the cultural and civilizational issues that we discuss on this podcast week in and week out. And to an extent, it definitely is on other kind of economic issues, but I would prefer a focus on some very different kind of economic issues, the likes of which our friend Doran Cass and the American Compass crew like to kind of highlight things of that nature. There, the southern border is certainly a major winning issue, I think, for conservatives right now. Crime, the litany and the list goes on. But I am not particularly enthused or inspired by kind of this momentary revival of kind of deficit hawkishness, which I certainly do not think represents kind of the best path forward for the Republican Party. The great ancient Chinese military general Sun Tzu. This is actually one of Senator Ted Cruz's very famous quotes. He's very fond of quoting Sun Tzu. He would actually do so in his oral arguments to the Supreme Court back when he was Texas Solicitor General. The ancient kind of Chinese historian or military strategist Sun Tzu famously said that a battle is won before it is fought. It is won based on the terrain on which it is fought. And this is fundamentally losing terrain, period, full stop, end of story.
So I guess I slightly disagree, not with your assessment, perhaps, of the politics involved, maybe. But I think we underestimate how much of the cultural stuff that we talk about every day or every week here, how much our opponents are just straight up funded by the federal budget. And I think there are some cuts here that are quite important. For example, there's some it's rollback of Biden's student loan plan. Probably won't matter because that particular plan will be gutted. But I think this could be fought in a way that is very connected to the more sort of, I agree that there are more existential issues facing America than the debt limit. That is, unless this is the moment where we're playing musical chairs and it falls on our heads. But let's assume that that's not the case, just as it wasn't the case in the Tea Party era. Let's assume for a moment that's not the case. I still think there are ways and ways to fight this. That there are millions and billions of dollars actually in the federal government that go directly to fund our cultural opponents. And I think there's a way to have that fight. The only other comment I have on all of this is I think this shows, I think potentially that the power relations within the Republican Party are important here. The fact that McCarthy could pass this bill, the fact that the sort of right wing of his caucus has more power because of the speakership fights earlier that we covered here months ago. I think those are important sort of dynamics for any future battle within the Republican Party. And I think those very well may turn out to be important. And this is the first time we're really seeing them get flexed, right? I think the folks that we would like to see have a bigger voice in the Republican Party probably are having a more serious seat at the table and more negotiating power within the Republican Party now. And we're seeing that this is the first result of that. So it's not that I think this particular fight is all encompassing or as important as perhaps some do. But I do think those power dynamics are probably important going forward for any one of the fights that we would want to pick up where the establishment Republican Party has been a complete failure.
So I don't have a ton to add here. My thought as a layperson is two things. One, are there any countries that have their national debt under control? Right. I'm not saying they operate in the black per se, but where the sort of debt to GDP ratio is, reasonable. And then two, what would a plan, sort of a multi-generational plan to get us to that point actually look like? And is there anyone who could or would propose that? I don't know. This is not an issue that I follow particularly closely. It was interesting that the press secretary brought up that if you have bills, you have to pay them, and was immediately dunked on online by people saying, "Oh, what about student loans?" But I'm just thinking about sort of long terms as a structural matter for the United States. Is there anyone who has or will present a plan to get us out of this situation? So that's the sort of main takeaway that I have on this one.
Fair enough. All right, Josh, give us your breakdown of your fascist gathering in Budapest.
Sorry, no, that was actually quite funny. Yeah. So look, I mean, like the longtime listeners of this show will, recall that I was actually just in Hungary a little over a year ago. I spoke at a conference at that time last February for MCC Matthias Corvinus Collegium. I was back this time for a panel for CPAC Hungary. It's the second annual CPAC Hungary. It was going to be at the last CPAC Hungary. Then they had to reschedule it because of the war in Ukraine. Couldn't make the rescheduled date. Neither here nor there. It was great to be back for this particular time. Yeah, I mean, it's worth, I think, kind of just talking a little bit about kind of why many have this obsession would be far too strong of a word, but kind of infatuation, perhaps, is kind of a longing from afar for Prime Minister Orban, his Fidesz party, and certain elements of kind of the national conservative, national populist elements of Hungary. And for that matter, certainly also kind of in other parts of Europe, especially kind of Central and Eastern Europe, the erstwhile Iron Curtain areas as well there. So this was an interesting conference, right? I mean, like it was a mix of Americans and Europeans. So I spoke on a panel about free speech and big tech. It was 2 Americans and 2 Europeans on the panel, including the moderator. And, a few kind of themes kind of percolate to the top of my mind. So, a lot of just general Europeans. I mean, I talked to kind of MEPs, members of European Parliament from the Netherlands, from Spain, various other countries as well. I was talking with a young Spanish activist, an activist for the Vox party there, which is kind of the national conservative, national populist party in Spain. And he kind of asked this interesting question. He was like, Josh, what is it that can actually like unite European conservatives, right? Like what is a conservative in Spain, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Poland, whatever? Like what do they share in common? And it's a very good question, right? Because I mean, like these are very distinct cultures with distinct customs, religion, languages. I mean, all the things the national conservatives hold dear. And it's kind of hard to answer that question with anything authoritative, except for like 2 things that kind of come to mind. And those 2 things that come to mind, I think, kind of underscore certain elements of the broader national conservatism project, which is I think the 2 things that I immediately thought of that can like tie together nationalists, conservatives, and populists from various different European countries is 1, actual nationalism, which obviously demands kind of a similar stance towards the European Union and kind of the liberal hegemony that Brussels, usually in cahoots with Frankfurt and Berlin, are able to kind of impose upon the entire European continent. And then the other thing that I think would tie a lot of European conservatives together, is a shared sense of Christendom and Christianity as well. And look, Hungary in particular, Hungary is not unique. I mean, it's a relatively small country. It's only about 10 million people, but it has stood out because Prime Minister Orban, who I've met numerous times now, and just to kind of reiterate my impressions from the first time I met him, is very far from the caricature that the MSNBC, New York Times talking head crowd likes to depict him as. This is a man who studied for a time at Oxford. He literally dedicates 1 day a week. I can't remember if it's Saturdays or Sundays, to just reading. And he's not necessarily reading kind of Twitter sound bites. He's like reading like real stuff. I mean, to kind of quote from Adrian Vermeil, Viktor Orban has done the reading. And he's also just like very congenial. Like he always answers every single question without pausing. He's very kind of non-politician like. But what Hungary has done most fundamentally, and our friend Chris Rufo, I think, got a really nice glimpse of this firsthand when he just spent roughly a month there or so on a Danube Institute fellowship. What the Hungarian right has been able to do, and this is, I think, what is most interesting from my perspective about that country in particular, is they have actually largely succeeded on the Rufo DeSantis-esque mission of recapturing institutions, of forming new institutions that have been viable, and then recapturing institutions that have been lost to the opposition. So if you look at kind of the broader kind of infrastructure of the Hungarian right, from the political scene to the universities, to think tanks, the media outlets, they really have achieved kind of cultural dominance. And that is in large part why the Fidesz party, Orban's party, has been in power now for well over a decade. To be clear, I mean, there is freedom of the press. Many of kind of the leading media organs in Budapest, which is the only kind of liberal enclave at this point in the entire country, many of the leading newspapers there are liberal, are anti-Orban, but at a certain level, a lot of kind of the cultural, kind of economic, geopolitical power centers have really been captured. And but from that perspective, it's just a very kind of interesting, I think, lens into a certain kind of different path forward. And speaking of different paths forward, one other thing that I think Hungary has become really well known as in certain kind of circles of the American right is its strong emphasis on natalism, pro-family policies, on really kind of structuring their entire tax code when it comes to property taxes, marital incentives. I mean, they've really engineered their entire tax code to incentivizing family formation. It's such a wonderful rebuke to kind of the brute nihilism that Delano kind of highlighted in his segment earlier. And we actually had the president of Hungary, Katalin Novak, who addressed us at our gala on Thursday evening, kind of going through the litany of pro-family policies. Gladden Papin has written voluminously on this. I had Gladden on my Newsweek podcast this week to discuss it. Shameless plug there. But yeah, I mean, that's basically the Hungary thing. It is kind of a real life experiment in kind of conservative governance oriented towards the common good that tends to eschew various liberal bromides when it comes to kind of neoliberal internationalism or kind of absolutist laissez-faire on the domestic sphere. So that's basically it. You know, I'm not an apologist for this country or anything. I mean, but I've enjoyed visiting. I've enjoyed speaking there. And I do think that there are lessons to be learned. So happy to open up whatever reactions or thoughts you guys have.
I like the left's conspiratorial reaction every time there's like a CPAC Hungary or something like that. I believe Josh was dubbed a dangerous individual. I'm probably paraphrasing like some weird leftist blog that thought it was a bad idea. But all that is to say, it's a strange conspiracy that conservatives are colluding to resurrect fascism because people are living in this completely upended century. There's a great Walter Russell Mead piece that I would commend everyone to read in Tablet magazine that's called "You Are Not Destined to Live in Quiet Times." It ran on Monday. So that it's surprising to the left and the media that people, you know, even with totally, I would say, different ideological frameworks, you know, the basic ideological framework of a lot of European social democracies, smaller countries with more homogenous populations is obviously completely different than the American left-right. And so that people in this very much not quiet century where life is changing at a pace that nobody, let alone their physical bodies, but their sort of emotional beings can keep track of, would talk to each other about maybe some ideas to help humanity flourish, that Christians across continents would get together and have those, say we share some common goals. Let's talk about what works and what doesn't, what's just and what's unjust. Is just like insane. And I think it's also a positive sign overall that American conservatism has broadened its horizons, that there's an out of the box, I think, a push to be a little bit more out of the box in the mentality that we bring to the kind of key cultural questions, key economic questions that are on the table. So I'm always interested to hear, you know, from folks who have gone over and talked to people over there. And I think it's worth that collusion, to borrow a word from the media.
Yeah, I guess my only thoughts on this are I see sort of a common thread in the way that Hungary is covered, Poland is covered, Israel. A lot of these sort of fundamentally domestic disagreements within some of these countries are covered as anti-democratic, as though, and it really does underscore, and I wish Ben were here to double underscore this, but it really does underscore the sort of our democracy. They really mean the R part, right? It's democracy until that democracy yields outcomes that are contrary to some of the sort of cultural propositions, like we can call them neoliberal propositions, that have become default. And it's funny because they really only have become default, even in America in the last 30 years. And anything that sort of, and certainly I wouldn't place it any farther back than the 60s, right? So in order to think that Hungary is anti-democratic, one has to think that most of the history of the United States and every so-called free country in the world, most of the history of those countries is anti-democratic. That in fact, democracy only came into being, right, at earliest in 1968. And I think this is a very revealing view. It shows how sort of those words like democracy or even liberalism have been claimed by a very small sort of faction. And I hear I'm speaking historically, not in terms of numerically now, but a small sort of faction of history. And in terms of the ways that man and even free men can arrange their affairs as fellow citizens. And there really seems to be an inability to legitimize any alternative arrangements of those affairs other than sort of the standard neoliberal, culturally woke proposition that's being advanced that, not coincidentally, is actually turns out to be quite unpopular when actually put to a real democratic test. And I think that that's probably the most important lesson for us in America from the way that what Hungary is doing, is this making this very clear that in fact, when they say anti-democratic, they just mean a people who votes or elects leaders that are willing to challenge that consensus.
No, when I think about Hungary, I think about their social policies that incentivize family formation, and actually recently in the States, a Texas lawmaker named Brian Slayton proposed a bill that sounds very much Hungarian in nature, right? Where he said parents with 4 kids will qualify for a 40% property tax discount, and if they go all the way up to 10 kids, then their house will be tax free. That's the type of policy making and the type of incentive structure that I think more conservatives will be open to in years to come. And then on the flip side, because one of the things that Hungary does, and I got a chance to moderate a panel with Balázs Orbán a couple of weeks ago at Heritage's 50th anniversary. They are very open in terms of protecting children from LGBT propaganda and content in a way that would make even a lot of people on the right in America very much uncomfortable. And I think about, Nikki Haley, who says that she's running for president, who recently said, Disney, I'd love to take, 70,000 jobs if you want to leave Florida. And much of the response to her is, you clearly don't know what time it is. So yes, you may get the jobs, and South Carolinians, may have some improved economic prospects, but at what cost? And I think that there's still some conservatives who don't understand that there are more ways to impose tyranny on a people than through big government. And when corporations weigh in on political matters, when they, as I said, propagandize our children, when they promote antinatalism, when they invest more in abortions for their female workforce than maternal leave, you get the types of things that we're experiencing here in the West, and Hungary seems to not be interested in going down that path at all.
All right, I'll go around the room for final thoughts.
I was going to pick off actually where you left off on the last segment, which is kind of this broader kind of, the way that the MSM and kind of all the usual suspects from the press to the universities to the political leadership kind of tend to depict the battles in countries like Poland, Hungary, Israel, Brazil, perhaps was to a slightly lesser extent. And, fundamentally, it is the same exact issue every single time that's really going on in all of these countries. And it just underscores, I think, kind of the vitality and indeed kind of the importance, the kind of borderline existential importance, I think, of the national conservatism project. And the fault lines of that battle in all of these countries is fundamentally nationalism versus liberal globalism. I mean that is the battle that is happening in each and every one of these countries. The battle that has been raging in Israel for the past few months over judicial reform, which I've discussed on this show, which is in somewhat of kind of a Mexican standoff situation right now. It's unclear at best what will emerge from that, but that fight all along has just been one proxy for this fight, where the Netanyahu coalition has been on the side of nationalism, and kind of the judicial supremacy juristocracy crowd has been on the side of kind of liberal hegemony, kind of the vindication and the supremacy of European Union funded NGOs, the U.S. State Department and all of that. Exact same thing in Hungary. I mean, all that the Hungarian right is fundamentally interested in doing is really what Delano just talked about, which is passing on kind of their language, their customs, their tradition, and above all else, their family from one generation to the next, and to shield it from the pernicious and insidious effects and byproducts of Brussels, Berlin, Washington, D.C., the United Nations, just all of the usual kind of globalist liberal forces out there. And, it is no accident, therefore, that kind of George Soros has chosen to kind of focus his ire on Israel and Hungary above perhaps all other countries except for the U.S. Now, he is Hungarian by birth, and he is ethnically, I guess, Jewish. Technically, he's halakhically Jewish, I believe, no matter how much he may detest his own Jewishness. But that aside, I guess one reason why he chooses to focus on Hungary and Israel above all else except for the US is that those are two instances where the forces of nationalism, traditionalism, religion, and so forth have actually fought back against global liberal hegemony. And, like I said, it's been nice to go to Hungary over the past couple of years, and good for CPAC, by the way, very good for CPAC. For kind of stepping in there, and basically just flipping two middle fingers to the establishment that would otherwise excoriate Central and Eastern Europe as full of kind of backwater bigots. So good for CPAC as well for kind of planting a flag there in the middle of the European continent.
I want to return to the Jordan Neely subject, and perhaps Delano will also give me a rebuttal again, but in terms of what he said in the beginning of the episode, I think the behind grab hold is something you do when you're not actually trying to have a fight with someone. You're trying to restrain someone who's insane, right? It's not like somebody offends and you confront them and you have perhaps outdated language in our modern era, and that's part of the problem. You can't have like an honorable fight, right? This isn't what that is. It's trying to guess when somebody who's not in touch with his surroundings or reality at all is going to be violent towards other people. And it seems pretty clear to me. Now, of course, none of us were on that subway car. And of course, I mean, it's possible for this to become a tribal incident. And in fact, I think it is, but I guess I don't think the tribal lines are where is being suggested. I think actually that the fact that they haven't been able to make this into the newest cause celeb, and they have been tried, they are really trying. So, maybe we'll come back next week and I'll say, they were able to do it. But I was on Chris Cuomo's show this week, and even his liberal callers are quite moderate on this situation and quite understanding of why this Marine behaved the way that he did. And they seem to think it's inherently reasonable. I think because many of them have been in that kind of situation. And yes, and I should let me make a point that I think Delano will very much agree with, which is a society loses something, particularly if men are trained to always sort of put their heads down, their eyes down, and look away and hope that sort of violence or insanity doesn't visit them. I think that there is something missing in a society that forces young men in particular to behave in such a, sort of emasculated way. And I think that that's going to become the crux of this case if it's even charged. I honestly, at this point, I'd give it a 50-50 coin flip that a grand jury is even going to charge this guy. I think the sentiment in the city is, I think there's at least a chance that even in this liberal city, he won't even be charged. And again, I could be, maybe I'm delusionally white pilled on this. But I think that there's a very small chance that he's actually convicted, even if he is charged, because like in the Bernie Getz case, where 6 out of 12 jurors had been the victim of some kind of street violence, right? There's this pervasive sense now. It's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 80s, but the trend lines are all bad. And there is this sort of general sense of disorder that pervades it, particularly on the subways. And I think that that's widespread enough, even among moderates and liberals, that I suspect this case will not go the way that, say, AOC thinks it's going to go. And I think that that's a really good thing. And finally, on that last bit, Josh mentioned, the good terrain for fighting the battle and determining who wins the battle. I think crime and disorder is a very good terrain for the right. I think we have thrown away that, or I should say I don't include myself in this, because of all my many political missteps and mistakes in my life that are looking back, this has never been one of them. I've never been on board for the sort of libertarian criminal justice reform project, but I think it's a advantage that the right has thrown away. I think is probably principally responsible, this kind of crime spike, for swinging the state of New York 20 points in a gubernatorial election. Now, they didn't make it over the finish line because, as they say, the red wave started below sea level, right? It didn't quite make it over the shore in the case of New York, but that's an equal swing of what happened in Florida, right? And I think that is almost entirely due to the crime issue. I think there's just something about living with that kind of fear and disorder on a regular basis that really tends to cut through people's politics. And it remains to be seen, but I definitely think it's quote unquote good terrain for the right. And I think that running on law and order will be just as potentially just as popular as it was in the 90s for the right, to where we basically we flipped the left to the point where even Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, right, had to go all in on the 1994 crime bill, because it's just something that ordinary people will not tolerate still. And I find that now, maybe I'm too optimistic on this one, and we'll see the liberal cities will once again find a new floor with which to be disappointing. But I think there's at least a potential here.
So I was actually going to talk about the coronation of King Charles and the people that I saw online who hate tradition. It's not just, we once were a British colony. We don't do monarchy in America. It's I think part of the reason that there was so much at least criticism, at least from what I saw, is because the people doing it are committed to destruction, deconstruction, dismantling every structure that creates and sustains life in a good and just society. And I think there is some connection to what Inez brought up, but I want to pivot to what she said, because I think this is something that where there is some broad consensus, and I think there should be broad consensus on the left and the right. I actually have an op-ed that I hope is coming out this week, hopefully at the Federalist, fingers crossed, on the pro-life case for law and order. And I make some of these exact arguments. I think that Planned Parenthood's expressed desire to defund the police should be like the bat signal for conservatives, that we should take up this issue as something that we run on. And not just as it relates to crime and disorder in downtown, high-end, business districts or the waterfront, but also in neighborhoods. And that's where I tend to focus most of my argument. It's the same argument you can apply anywhere in the city. But there are people who live under the constant threat of violence, and neighborhoods where it is more common than we would like to acknowledge to see young men who have their names written in obituaries before they get them on diplomas. And I don't think that that's something that the right should run away from. I will say this to Inez's point on this specific case. I understand. There are a lot of things that people do during the course of, an interaction, of this type that I understand. Um, I understand why someone would want to restrain Jordan Neely. And I think Inez used the word guess in terms of what he may do. I guess my only point is that there is a heavy price to pay if you guess wrong. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. And again, the different identities at play to me are irrelevant. I also know that if this was a Black man who had restrained Jordan Neely, then this probably wouldn't get much light anyway. AOC, Ayanna Pressley, none of these people would be interested in it. And that's a sad commentary on our political class. But these are things that I think, require, some deep thinking and proper policy responses, but really a shift in our culture. And I think we talk about this all the time. Like, there was a 13-year-old kid in DC a couple months ago who was shot, and he tragically, unfortunately died while him and a friend were out trying to steal cars at 4 a.m. And when his mom went to her press conference with her attorney, because of course, she said, "Well, would you guys have felt better if it was 4 p.m?" And I said, "This is completely the wrong response, right?" So my friends and I, as we were discussing it, in our text chat, we were like, I understand how a guy would make that decision. But the man was actually charged. At first, people thought he was a white ex-cop, and I think that's what drove a lot of the local and even international coverage. But he ended up being a Black city worker, and it took a little while to charge him. But he'll have to face a jury because of this. So I think these are bad choices all the way around. But coming back to the central point, the civil magistrate has to enforce law and order, because they have to keep two things at bay. One is lawlessness, and the second is vigilantism. Neither of those things are good for a society. So I hope we don't see more of these incidents, but something tells me this isn't the last one.
Very quickly before we wrap, I'll return to the Walter Russell Mead piece that I mentioned earlier in Tablet Magazine, because I think his framing is really helpful. You are not destined to live in quiet times. Remember that, because it's the reality. It's not a choice. It's not up for debate. The story of human history is right now, there's no question about it, at a very, very strange and fluid moment. There's nothing we can do about it except for try to make it as peaceful as possible, and to promote human flourishing as much as we possibly can, which means that these conversations are going to be enormously tumultuous. They're going to be disrupted by generative AI, by all kinds of different technologies, by artificial wombs. It's all going to make it much, much more difficult for us to have these conversations. There will be upsides to these technologies, and we would be unwise to act as though that isn't the case. But it is incumbent upon all of us to wake up every day and recognize that we are not living in quiet times. We are not destined to live in quiet times. And that makes every single day a challenge that we have to meet with that context in mind, that you are living a very unusual life for somebody with the software that we are born with. So just, I think I found that a very helpful framing, and wanted to toss that over to the group. So on behalf of Delano, Inez, Josh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.